Now, Senator Bernie Sanders and Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez have teamed up together to introduce legislation to take it to the credit card companies. Now, let me give you the details. According to the Washington Post, basically, their legislation would cap credit card interest rates at a total of 15%. Now, in addition to that, and it's not only 15% on interest rates for credit cards, but other consumer loans as well. States could also vote to establish their own lower limits under the legislation and would allow the U.S. Postal Service to get into the banking business, including offering savings and checking accounts. So we would literally have the U.S. Postal Service as a bank. That's awesome. That would be amazing for people because then they could put their money into the post office bank instead of dealing with credit unions or national corporations, like Citibank, Chase, JP Morgan, etc. All right. Now, Sanders, I'm getting ahead of myself. I was going to do a quote here. But first, more details. The 15% cap would be the same one that Congress imposed on credit unions back in the 1980s. However, the National Credit Union Administration, the industry's regulator, did raise that cap to 18% and has renewed it since 1987 at higher levels. So there's the details on that. Now, Sanders, speaking to the Washington Post in an interview, said that a decade after taxpayers bailed out the big banks, the industry is taking advantage of the public by charging exorbitant rates. Wall Street today, he said, makes tens of billions from people at outrageous interest rates. And I'll get to those numbers as well. AOC, who will introduce the House version of the bill, said, quote, there is no reason a person should pay more than 15% interest in the United States. It is a debt trap for working people, and it has to end. But she's absolutely right. This is a huge problem, considering how Americans have more than $1 trillion in credit card debt. It actually used to be the number one amount of debt that people had, but has been surpassed by student loans. And then mortgages also are very, very high in the amount of debt that people have in America. Now, since interesting here is that, I know we're talking about interest, so unintentional pun there. A lot of times when you make a payment on your credit card or make a payment on student loans or any other type of loan, if you're poor, interest eats up a lot of your payment. And you really don't make that much of a dent on the principal. So if you're, low income, if you're low, poor credit, and you get this high interest rate, it can be really, really difficult to not fall into a debt spiral when you can barely afford the interest. You can't even touch the principal. It's another way that being poor costs you a lot of money. Now, of course, who's fighting this initiative? Well, you guys already know. It's the banks. Interest payments, turns out, is a huge chunk of their revenue. As Sanders had mentioned before, the financial industry actually brought in about $113 billion in interest fees from credit cards alone last year. That is $113 billion. They're making billions of dollars in interest, up 35% since 2012, according to the S&P Global Market or Global Market Intelligence. That's up 35%. Now, this proposal, according to bank spokesperson or for the American Bankers Association, Jeff Sigmund, said, quote, this specific proposal will only harm consumers by restricting access to credit for those who need it the most and driving them towards less regulated, more costly alternatives. Richard Hunt, chief executive of the Consumer Bankers Association, another industry group that includes JP Morgan Chase and Bank of America, called the 15% cap arbitrary. He said, one-size-fits-all caps would make all loans harder for Americans with lower credit scores or non-traditional sources of income to receive. But now wait a minute. It's the banks themselves that make the decision to loan out the money or issue credit cards. What they're saying is, unless we can, price gouge you with interest and bring in billions of dollars in revenue from interest and fees on our credit cards, if we can't do that, then what's the point? Then we're not going to loan out money. We're not going to add to the economy. Well, then what's the point of you existing? You're a bank. You're supposed to loan out money. I mean, come on. It's pretty funny because these banks had actually loaned money to Donald Trump without a problem. Trump is $1 billion loser, and they still loan money out to him. Now, speaking of Trump, of course, the banks love him because one of his recent changes would allow debt collectors to call people with credit card debt or student loan debt 7 times a week and text and email as much as they want. So they love Trump, they love Republicans, but they hate this. And some of them are actually kind of scared that something like this could actually pass under a more progressive government. My example here is Jarrett Seberg, who's an analyst with Cowen's Washington Research Group, and she said in a research note, quote, "The progressive attack is organized, and there are multiple paths for them to achieve victory. It is why we believe this is a risk that is worth monitoring. That risk is you getting lower interest rates. And I would remind you that the banks themselves, after they crashed the economy in 2008, continued to receive incredibly low interest rate loans from the Federal Reserve. And they continue to this day. I wish we could get the rates that the banks get. They get these loans from the Federal Reserve at super low interest rates. They jack up the interest rates way above 15%, and then loan it out to us, who are barely struggling to make it by. A lot of people live on credit because they don't make enough money, and that's of course one problem leading to other problems. But the main problem here is Americans, their wages are stagnant. They're not making enough money. I think it was 40% of Americans can't afford a $500 emergency. That's horrible. And it turns people to have to do credit. And of course, there are these predatory lending institutions that say, okay, well, you need us, so we're going to jack up your interest rate super high and wring every penny we can from you. That is the business model, right? And now, let me get to the interest rates of what they currently have. Apparently, the average interest rate is about 21%. That's according to creditcards.com, which tracks data since 2007 and compiles data from 100 different popular credit cards. Now, that median interest, as I said, was about 21.36% last week. So they asked them last week, hey, what's the interest at? 21.3%. And it rose from 12.62% a decade ago. So it nearly doubled within the last 10 years. Gee, what happened within the last 10 years? We were recovering from a giant financial crisis in which the banks had caused. And their response to it, after getting bailed out by the taxpayer, is to gouge the taxpayer by charging enormous interest rates. And those rates have been rising fastest with people for people with the lowest credit scores. Now, according to Ted Rossman, an industry analyst for creditcards.com, he said, quote, "Issuers are taking an opportunity to charge people with lesser credit a bit more." Now, if you thought having a good credit score, being responsible and all that would help you get a better rate, well, no. For borrowers with good credit scores, high credit scores, the average interest rate was still around 17.73% compared to 16.71% a year ago. And if you have a bad credit score, you would have to pay 25% in interest. That's crazy. I mean, it's not just crazy. It's usury. We used to have laws against that. Now, look, I get reducing risk and all, and banks assessing whether or not they will loan out money, but this is insane. This leads to even more debt and even worse outcomes. So I'm glad that Bernie Sanders and AOC, they're working together. They're trying to solve this problem. And so, look, from this, we can tell who's actually going to be on our side and who's going to be in the side of the big banks. Hey guys, hopefully you enjoyed that free video. Now I'm going to have to ask you a favor. Between the demonetization and the YouTube algorithm messing around with view counts, etc., we're having a hard time adjusting to the new YouTube reality, which is where you guys come in. See, we have a Patreon, patreon.com/TYTNation, set up to help us rely on you guys, the viewers, instead of big corporate ads. Look, you know the show. You know how I'm not in favor of big corporations anyway. So help us transition away from relying on the ad model to pay the bills and sign up to be a patron, patreon.com/TYTNation. That goes a long way to help us keep the lights on. And you guys will know that you're supporting independent, progressive media.